Good afternoon, everyone. Now I assume you could all hear me? Okay. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sheryl Ayala. I teach biology, and I'm going to be moderating this panel. And this is part, as you know, of the 10th Annual Academic Symposium, in which we're talking about freedom of speech, civility, and civility, and where does one end and the other begin. And this has been a controversy for years and years, and I don't know that we're going to solve any problems, but hopefully we'll generate some good questions and try to find some answers. The purpose of this panel is to look at freedom of speech, civility, and truth at Marian University. And we're going to be looking at how students, how faculty, and how staff feel about freedom of speech and civility. What's their perspective on what it means to have freedom of speech and what it means to be civil in a university setting. To give us a dose of reality, we also have an individual who's going to be talking about the institutional perspective. I might as well introduce the panel at the time, and then I could tell you what each of them will be doing. One of our speakers is John St. Peter, who's our institutional attorney.
Hello, everyone.
And John will be giving us a dose of reality in terms of the legal perspective on all of this. Our second panelist is Dr. Ed Ogle, who is our Executive Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs. And he will be Academic Affairs?
No.
And student still.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. I was going to say good afternoon, but I want to wait till
Well, now that you've interrupted her.
too anxious to jump in.
I go too fast to be interrupted. And Dr. Ogle will be giving us an institutional perspective, somewhat of a reality check on the institutional perspective of civility and freedom of speech.
Thank you, Sheryl. Good afternoon, everyone.
And our next panelist is Jeff Reed, Dr. Jeff Reed, who is the Dean of the School of Business and Public Safety and also a faculty member. And he will be giving us a faculty perspective on freedom of speech, civility, from the faculty point of view.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
And our next speaker is Shane Leach. Shane is our staff Senate president, and he's going to be providing the staff perspective on freedom of speech and civility and truth. They were all doing truth. I just forgot to mention it.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope they all present the truth, but thank you, and welcome to the panel.
And lastly, but not least, we have Angie Viss. Angie is our president of the Student Senate and will be providing, obviously, the student perspective on freedom of speech, civility, and truth. So the plan for the afternoon is that we're going to have Dr. Ogle provide us an institutional perspective initially. And our next step will be the real reality check with John St. Peter providing the legal perspective of freedom of speech and freedom of speech, civility, truth at an academic institution. And then we'll have Dr. Reed talk about the faculty perspective. Then they said in almost perfect order. Then we'll have Shane give us the staff perspective and Angie give us the student perspective. We're going to give each of the panelists about 10 minutes. They're going to address some questions that we posed in advance, and I'll give you an idea of those questions. Basically, the questions to be addressed by the panelists relating to the individuals that you represent at the university, in other words, the university as a whole, the legal issues, or the student, faculty, or staff issues. From your particular perspective, what is the perspective on freedom of speech, civility, and truth at Marion? Do individuals in your area feel free to speak about issues and concerns that arise in their particular area? Do individuals in that area feel free to discuss general issues and concerns that might be contrary to public opinion or public norms? And do individuals in your area feel as though they're listened to, heard, respected? And what we're hoping is to get a sense of how each of these groups really perceives freedom of speech and civility. I've asked them to address these questions from the perspective of the overriding theme of the entire symposium. And some of the questions that have been coming up that were actually generated for the symposium were, what's our responsibility towards civility? And what are the ramifications? What happens in cases of incivility? What do we do? How does it impact people? How do we perceive our right to freedom of speech? And what happens if we feel we have lost that freedom of speech in reality or through perception? Where does the right to freedom of speech end and the responsibility towards civility begin? And when does the curtailing of freedom of speech result ultimately in limiting truth? So those are the questions that the symposium is talking. So that's the framework I've asked each of the panelists to discuss the questions we addressed above. So before we go on, there's a very short, I was supposed to be the hands-off moderator, but I have to read this to you. We talk about civility. We talk about freedom of speech. We can have freedom of speech and totally wreck people if we're willing to suffer consequences. I guess we have the freedom to do anything. But there was an editorial in the paper several days ago. And the title of it was, "Let's Take a Time Out and End This Age of Incivility." And I'd like to read it to you briefly. It's pretty short. Have you seen the commercial promoting civility in public discourse? A man and woman obviously on opposite sides of an issue are arguing at a town meeting, raising their voices and calling each other names, when a little girl seated in the audience says, "I think someone needs a time out." The two embroiled in the argument look at the girl, then with shame at each other. They both say they should take a time out. The woman apologizes, the man makes a motion that he should start showing more respect, and they shake hands. As the music rises in the commercial, the tagline, "Civility, pass it on," flashes on the screen. The commercials are a product of the Foundation for a Better Life, a nonprofit organization that creates public service campaigns to communicate the values that make a difference in our communities. The messages appear on TV and movie theaters, on billboards, on the radio, internet, and they model the benefits of a life lived by positive values. We believe people are basically good, but sometimes just need a reminder, the group says. Is this simplistic? Is this Pollyanna? Maybe. But just maybe they have something there at the foundation. What if we all started to live by the rule that most people are basically good? What if our legislators started listening to each other and started to compromise to reach solutions for the greater good, not the good of the political party? What if we stopped using every trick in the book, every tactic, just because we could, and instead did the right thing? If there is anything wrong with the message from the Foundation for Better Life, it's that adults in the room need a child to remind them how to behave. I wonder how the tone of the debate in committees or on the floor in Madison or in Washington would change if a group of 6-year-olds were in the audience, if some of those 6-year-olds were the children or grandchildren of the legislators on the floor. We tend to be on our best behavior around our children. We model the behavior we hope they will embrace. So keep that child in the room, tucked away somewhere in your mind, when you're angered by another driver or tempted to flip them off, when a customer service employee doesn't respond in the way you had hoped, when you file your next complaint with a business, when you argue with your spouse or a friend, when you're just generally sure your opinion is the right one. Civility, pass it on. How is that going to impact us at Marian University? And with that, I'd like to call on John St. Peter to give his perspective.
Thank you, Sheryl. Ed, could I?
Oh, you can scream.
She's nationalized the microphone. But then again, I gave it to her. As a lawyer, I have to start with a disclaimer so that people understand my role today, and I hope free me to say things that might be a little more creative than I otherwise would. I'm not here, although I have an affiliation with the university. I'm an outside lawyer. I'm a private lawyer. But I do, on occasion, I'm called by the university to help them with various issues. But I'm not here today as a university spokesperson. All right, and I do mean that seriously, so I don't want anybody writing down the university's lawyer said A, B, or C, okay? I mean, and so that's one disclaimer. The next one is I'm not providing legal advice to anyone. And I think looking at this room, we're all mature enough to know that any case worth its merit is based upon specific facts, right? Tell me the facts, and I'm going to help you with the conclusion. Change one fact, and you have a different conclusion, at least in the law, okay? Maybe not in the context of ethics or morals or education, but, I mean, that's part of our education, too. Mix the facts up, and you usually have a different answer. So no legal advice. And then sometimes I'm going to spill over into, opinion. I mean, personal opinion, or, by definition, a lot of the discussion this afternoon is going to be outside the box of legal opinion, okay? So with those disclaimers, I thought I would at least set the table in terms of the legal context of free speech and civility so that other speakers then get into the more serious issues of, all right, that's what the law is, but now how do we handle it from a different perspective? Let me start with the hard reality of the First Amendment. Everybody's proud of the First Amendment. It's one of the things that is the shining light for our country. But it allows things to happen that sometimes are very, very unpleasant, and allows some horrible behavior to occur. At lunch, we were talking to a couple of examples. One was the annual march of these abhorrent neo-Nazis through Skokie, Illinois, because of Skokie's long tradition of being a place where some survivors of the Holocaust happen to live. Believe it or not, the First Amendment allows that march, assuming it isn't violent. Can't throw rocks through a window, right? But the march occurs. And there are other examples of conduct that no one in this room would support, but at the same time, they fall within the purview of the First Amendment. The First Amendment, again, a reminder, one of the bedrocks of our country is that we don't have to ask the sovereign, the king, or in our instance, the government. Okay? We don't have to ask the government for permission to speak, right? We start with that premise. Most societies have a different premise, especially, well, I won't name countries, but it was a radical idea, and it continues to be a radical idea. We don't seek permission to express opinions. In fact, it's the opposite. The government is prohibited from interfering with what we say, except in certain limited situations. And those are, you all know this from civics. Do they teach civics anymore? Okay. I remember civics. It was kind of a cool class, but I've forgotten most of it, and I had to go to law school to be reminded of it. But sometimes I wonder how much civics we all remember. But under the First Amendment, the areas of speech that are not protected, in other words, this is where the government can prevent you from speaking. Speech inciting imminent lawless action. Imminent lawless action. I stand up, I get you worked up, I say, let's all go out and burn Sheryl's car. That crosses the line, you know, and I start to head out. Clearly, the government has a role in prohibiting that. Another thing that you've all heard is you don't have a right to stand up in a movie theater and say fire, right? You've all heard that. Clearly, that's beyond your privilege or your right, and the government can intervene. So it comes under the rubric of a true threat. The second category is sometimes referred to as unlawful harassment. And that's something we're going to spend some time in today. But it's not what you think it is. It's not merely using a particular derogatory term or being insulting. It's extreme to the point of causing either personal injury or some other form of imminent threat. But that is an issue that our society today is working on. And it's very complicated. And then defamation, okay? No one has a right to defame. I'll use me as a guinea pig. Sorry, Sheryl, I'll use you for the first one. No one has a right to say John St. Peter is a criminal, he stole money, and he doesn't have a law license. Those are all false. By the way, if they're true, that's an absolute defense. You can say the most horrible thing. I mean, you can say that John Doe is a thief. He stole $10,000 from his mother-in-law from the piggy bank. If true, that's a complete defense to a defamation. But defamatory conduct or speech is not covered by the First Amendment, and you see litigation on that all the time. And then the fourth category is obscenity. The First Amendment, at some point, has the ability to regulate obscene, pornographic. The question is, where's that point? And today, in the law, it's hard to tell you where that point is. The courts have had a very difficult time defining that. I am frequently asked to write an adult entertainment ordinance for a municipality, okay? Talk about a challenge. my first disclaimer to the client, whether it's a county, a village, or a city, is this will have a half-life of about 6 months until the next case. Until the next case says that you can't do this or can't do that. Very difficult, but essentially the key, the art, is avoiding content, focus on procedure. And so what do I mean by that? And I'm just giving this an example. About the only ordinance that is going to be sustained by court is that, for instance, you regulate where it's located. Is it in a zone? Is it close to a school, a grade school? Okay, you can regulate that, or setback. You can regulate hours. You can have requirements about lighting. You can have requirements about the separation between the entertainer who is performing under the First Amendment. Okay, that's protected by the First Amendment, and the customer. So those are the four categories on the First Amendment. Now, it's a couple of other just clean-up comments, and then turn it over to the people that have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis and have the challenge of it. First of all, so that everyone's aware of what the law is anyway, the law does not recognize one's right not to be offended. Double negative in there. I apologize to the grammarians, but the law does not recognize one's right not to be offended. Merely saying I was offended by what something said may be true, and it may be worthy of further discussion, but don't talk law, because it's not part of the law, okay? It's worthy of talk. I'm not saying these are legal principles. It doesn't mean they are not things that we have to, as a society, talk about, and as a community, talk about. Okay, that's one thing. Next, the Western presumption of truth is that without the freedom to offend, the freedom of expression ceases to exist. The common assertion that you often hear, and I took this from a recent newspaper article, the freedom of speech is not the right to insult the community. That's not the law. It may be a valid statement. It may be something where we need to move to, but it's not the law. In fact, historically, this has very little credence. And when you change the facts a little bit and remove it from our country and look at cases such as, you remember when Khomeini threatened Salman Rushdie because of the book? None of us had any trouble with laughing at that, right? And saying that that was wrong. And yet, the premise of Khomeini was that Rushdie did not have the right to insult a community. The premise of the First Amendment is not that the only effective way to kill a bad idea is through suppression. The premise of the First Amendment, from a legal perspective, is that the solution is to expose the idea for what it's worth or not worth, and to supplant it with better ideas. It's the marketplace idea. It's inefficient, it's sloppy, it's often ugly, but that is the bedrock of where we are. In other words, what we want, at least in our legal system, is unfettered, what I'll call liberal science, and I don't mean it from a biology or a physics point of view, but we want unfettered democracy so that we create the ability to criticize bad ideas, and there are no shortage of them, so that the cure is to ridicule, criticize, and replace misinformation, ignorance, and superstition. So that's the legal framework, and I'll pass it on to people that have to deal with it day to day.
Thanks, John. I want to share with you some of the framework guiding my remarks to give you the context and hopefully help you appreciate my comments. Freedom of speech, civility, and truth. As I think of freedom of speech in this context, to me it's what? What is discussed and where? We're talking about freedom of speech. Civility, it's how things are discussed. Truth, I think of truth two different levels. One is more the abstract, the ideal. There's a quote from Flannery O'Connor that says, "Truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it." So the sense of unchanging, not something any one of us possesses, but something to be discovered. And second level of truth, which I think applies more to our conversation, is this sense of truth and knowing facts or reality. What is the truth? I recall a popular movie years ago where Tom Cruise was an attorney insisting he wanted the truth. I want the truth. I want the truth. And Jack Nicholson was on the stand saying, you can't handle the truth. For the purposes of our discussion, I'm talking about truth in this latter sense, knowing facts or reality. Marion is a private institution, and just prior to joining Marion, I was working at a public institution, and I could appreciate the difference between public institutions and private. When I was new at the public institution, I heard this term FOIA, and people say, well, that's FOIA this, FOIA. And after a while, I pulled a colleague aside and said, what is FOIA? And it was an acronym for the Freedom of Information Act. So being a public college, there's a sense of public ownership and public right to know. And so the public is free to ask the questions and have more transparency because of the nature of the public supporting this institution. And so we had to be aware of that and be very comfortable with that. And so meetings and issues were very different at a public institution than they are at Marion as a private Catholic institution. For example, there's not much discussion here about whether anybody has an issue with starting a meeting or a class with prayer. That's just not an issue here, right? In the public sector, that's an important issue where there are limits to what people can do in that regard and how that's controlled. So this is part of my thinking, too, from an institutional perspective, remembering that Marion as a private Catholic institution affects my comments and my perspective. In the same sense of knowing facts or reality or maybe hiding or shielding the truth, there's an appreciation for people's privacy, too, and the context or the settings for sharing information. Some of the discussions that happen at, I'll say, an institutional level have to do with personnel, and so these are not public matters. And so this, too, affects our notion of not only freedom to speak, but freedom to know the truth. So my role at the university is, I'll capture it by the 3 Ps. I have a role as a participant. I participate in dialogue and discussions. And so that's what I bring and mindful of who I am. I also have a role to protect and promote freedoms. So in this sense, I'm a guardian of freedoms. And, you know, it's interesting to listen to John start his comments with a disclaimer. I'm very aware of the tension that I have personally, knowing that I have to be mindful of where I think my liberties as an individual start and end, and where I'm a representative for Marian University. And it's not always clear. Being relatively new to the community, as I'm introduced to others in the community, I'm introduced as Ed Ogle, Marian University. It's that close link. And so I don't have the freedoms to say what I want, where I want, without remembering who I am and what I represent, meaning that I represent a broad spectrum of people that we call Marian University. And so there are I have to clarify for myself and for others, which John did, when I'm speaking for Ed Ogle, when I'm speaking as a prominent member of Marian University. By choosing to be part of Marian, this culture, you know, a question I have for myself is, have I implicitly agreed to surrender elements of free speech? As I think about this, I say, no, I'm not surrendering free speech. It's more the case that I agree to align my actions, my speech, so that I stay in harmony with the culture ethos that is Marian. So in that regard, I'm not surrendering as much as I am choosing to self-regulate how I conduct myself, what I say, and where I say it, knowing that people don't always understand. It's not always blatantly clear when I'm speaking as a private citizen or when I'm speaking as a member of Marian University. So I have this responsibility, and it's not me, it's all of us that are part of Marion. When do we have authority to speak on behalf of the university, knowing that the university is a representation of other people? It represents students, current and past, staff, faculty, and when does one have this authority to speak for others in this regard? Sometimes it's a matter of one's academic background, where due to the nature of the study and credentials, people have this credibility to speak in these areas. But it's important to make disclaimers. Just as we saw from John, it's common that people will say, no, I'm going to share my opinions based on my study and my background, but I want to make it clear I'm speaking for me and my academic discipline, not for Marian University. So it's important that people understand the distinctions and know where they have freedoms and where our speech has to align with the values Marian University promotes. If I choose to make statements as a private citizen in a public forum, for example, a letter, let's say I want to write a letter to the editor and take a stand to endorse a political candidate, it's very important that I don't carry or pretend, imply that I'm speaking on behalf of Marian University. And so in that regard, I would not carry or suggest what my professional title is, but now I'm speaking as a private citizen, and make that clear to the audience. Where it gets interesting, or where we have to exercise judgment, is when, whether it's intentional or not, individuals in public arenas sometimes present themselves in a manner that could be interpreted as representing Marion. And that may be by the way one's dressed or how one presents oneself. And lines then get crossed, where we think, no, I'm speaking as an individual, but the perception is somehow I'm representing Marian University. And in this case, we have to be careful because of privileges of a position or association with the Marian can be abused. This can happen outside of the university and also inside the university. In higher ed, it's common during political seasons for people to allege that a professor is taking a platform within a classroom to promote a very specific political agenda. And it's important that we talk through these issues to make it clear that the information presented is related to the class or not. If it's not, that's not appropriate as part of the instructional setting. The second level, so that's me as an individual, us as individuals associated with this greater entity, which is Marian University. The second level is protecting the reputation of the university as an organized body, but it's a body without a voice. This institution is a collection of people, and we have responsibility to consider the impact or effect on all stakeholders that we consider Marian. And this is part of the protection yet guardian role we have at the institutional level. And we have to keep in mind that part of Marian is the sense that we have this Catholic identity. And do the actions and speech, the expressions promote and advance our Catholic identity, or do they sully or harm the reputation of the institution? As well, we are an institution of higher learning, and so we have to create and preserve these safe harbors for advancing learning. In this regard, we really have to promote this sense of neutrality and make sure that people know they have the freedom to explore and express ideas without crossing lines or inadvertently misrepresenting what we are all about as an institution of higher learning. So choosing to become part of Marion, to belong to Marion, means we are making a choice. And we are choosing to become part of a culture that has defined social norms that are acceptable and also those that are not. And so for me, an important part of the discussion of freedom is not so much losing something, but choosing to be part of something that's going to have a cultural context for indicating what is acceptable and what is not as we know ourselves as Marian University. Which means there will be limitations. For example, we can ask ourselves, is one completely free to express oneself in a classroom setting? Well, no, it's got to be somehow related to the subject matter at hand. We really do not have the freedom to say whatever we want, when we want, wherever we want. This will be conditioned by the choices we make to be part of this larger community. I'll close by just summarizing what I think is the institutional perspective. And from my position, it's really a matter of balancing interests, these points I've made. That's the perspective I bring to the discussion, is thinking of all the stakeholders affiliated with Marion, having a balance of interest for all involved.
Thank you, Ed. And John, thank you. It would be hard for me to claim that I represent all of the faculty members. And indeed, if I attempted to do that, I'm sure I would have a number of faculty members who would be in a little bit of disagreement with me. So my first disclaimer is that I am a faculty member. I'm taking off my hat as a dean now, and I'm speaking as a faculty member about my perspective. And I also recognize that I have a role as a faculty member, as a teacher. I have a role as a scholar. I have a role as an advisor. And I have a role as a colleague. And as a faculty member, I exercise my responsibilities, my freedoms, within the context of this institution in those various different roles. And so that's part of laying the context. I want to also link us back to the core values of Marion and our mission, because what's important for me as a faculty member, there are two core values that are particularly important for me at Marion. The first is community. This is an academic community. It's a community in which we all live, the faculty, the students, the staff. We all live here, we work here, we are here together. And we have to remember that when we do things as members of that community, what we do has an impact on the other members of the community. And part of what makes a community work and be successful is that we understand each other, we trust each other, we build relationships with each other. When we do things that betray that trust, when we do things as members of the community that are harmful to other people, we betray that trust and we diminish community. And if we do that repeatedly, the sense of community begins to evaporate and fade away. So the first thing is, it's important for us to recognize that as faculty members, me as a faculty member, I exist within a community. The second thing is the core value of learning, and that's to recognize that that's our goal here. This is an enterprise-wide goal. It's not just a word on the plaque on the wall. It's what we're about here. It's about learning, seeking knowledge, understanding truth, wisdom, gaining understanding. That's what it's all about. As a faculty member, my goal is to seek this for myself, to contribute to the larger body of knowledge, to share the wisdom that we all have with students, to model the way for students, and to encourage students to become learners, to become seekers of truth and wisdom. And that's what we're all about in this learning community at Marion. Now, John has set the context very well for freedom of speech, so I don't feel a need to pursue that a lot, although I got lots of notes on it. But what I do want to say is that in a classroom, whether it's philosophy or theology or history or management or music or whatever it happens to be, we are called to understand, to learn, and to recognize that there are a variety of sources, traditions, beliefs, facts, theories, and we have to look at them and evaluate them and determine what makes most sense, what is most correct, if you will, and help to move ahead as we sort out the wheat from the chaff. Now, John's already talked about what we have some ability to do or not do, and so I'm going to move on beyond that. But as we think about civility, one of the things that my grandmother admonished me when I was young was, she said, "Is that something you want on the front page of the paper? When you do something, you want everybody in your community to know because they read the paper and there you are on the front page of the paper. Is it good? Is it bad? And if it's good, great, go ahead and do it. If you don't feel comfortable having this splashed on the front page of the paper with your picture, don't do it." And that ought to be a good test for you to decide, should I or should I not do something? Okay. Now, as a Rotarian, I take the Forward Pledge seriously. The first plank of the four-way trust is it the truth? Okay. So you think about, is this the truth when I'm behaving? Okay. The other thing that my grandmother said is, separate the person from the position. You may disagree with the person, but that doesn't mean that you disrespect the person. You may be wrong. They may have some element of truth in their position. So it's incumbent upon you, Jeff, to respect the other person when you're disagreeing with them. Lay out your facts, lay out your data, lay out your position. It's okay to disagree, but respect the person. The Institute for Civility and Government defines civility as claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading something else in the process or someone else in the process. You know, I think they took that from my grandmother.
I think your grandmother took it from the Bible.
Well, maybe she did.
And the Bible took it from the Greeks, etc.
Now, what's the problem in an academic setting? People are people. And we have beliefs. And we have passions. And somehow we sometimes allow our passions to cloud our judgment. And we've seen that for many years. The question that we need to be asking is, where's the data? This proposal that you're giving us, does it make sense? How does it square with past reality or other understandings of the world that we have? Okay. The problem is, maybe that sort of says that the research that I did isn't right. And then we get a little bit protective or defensive or upset because somebody's saying, well, maybe your idea wasn't totally correct. Okay. We've seen problems in terms of, in an academic setting, looking at things, the tension between evaluating different ideas, and sometimes we do a better job than others. Sometimes the professor, who's the known hero in the field, the person who is the person who's written the books and has the reputation and does the national tours and is speaking, becomes a little bit too full of himself or herself and isn't willing to consider other ideas. Why does that become a problem? It becomes a problem when all of a sudden we have new ideas that we really ought to consider. But somehow, because of the politics and because of the power brokers, we don't consider them. Now, we've all heard of the classics. You can talk about Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and Einstein, all of whom, when they first offered their ideas, were ridiculed, were scorned, were denigrated by the power brokers because what they were proposing was at odds with the orthodoxy of the time. Couldn't possibly be right. Einstein's theories couldn't possibly be right. They just didn't work. They didn't square with Newton, so they couldn't be right. You know? So we look at that. We look at history. We look at what's gone on. I mean, there are a number of things that have gone in my own discipline. We look at the psychology in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, what the tension between different behaviorist schools, some of whom were very classical and some of who were very different. We have the operant learning approach versus the classical learning approach. And we have people that are disagreeing with each other. Sometimes professionally, sometimes, unfortunately, a little bit less than professionally. We have the challenge now in anthropology. I'm fascinated by this. The prevailing wisdom for about the last 30 years has been that the Americas were settled by the people who crossed the land bridge from Asia about 10,000 years ago. But the question is, if that's how these continents, North and South America, were settled, then how come we have archaeological evidence of settlements 15 and 20,000 years ago? But yet we have the people who are closing out that discussion because they will not accept the data because it's not good enough, or they don't believe it, or they don't like it. Okay? So what's the message here? The message is that as faculty members, we have to be open to looking at alternative points of view. We have to bring into our classrooms, okay, here's the conventional wisdom, and here are some other approaches which might have some merit, and be willing to consider those things. The academic institution is the marketplace of ideas. It's the place where we take a look at what the ideas are, what the thoughts are, and we begin to sort out what makes sense in terms of our understanding of the world. And as we do that, we have a responsibility as academics to model civility for our students and to engage in the discussion with our colleagues within the framework of civility. So I'll close there and pass the mic on to Shane.
I don't need both of them, but I'll just take this one, I guess. Okay. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues for setting a very full table. I'm not exactly sure what more I'm going to discuss, but I have some notes for you guys. So the first thing that I want to do is just briefly touch on Dr. Ogle's points that he made, because a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about with the staff are going to pour out of that choice that we as staff make when we choose to work at Marian University. We choose to subscribe to those core values. We choose to subscribe to the way things are done. And so I'm not going to touch on a lot of that stuff. But what I am going to touch on is this notion that as staff, we serve the community. We are here to serve the students. We are here to serve the faculty, and in some cases, serve the administration. So with that, what I want to discuss is, this notion of freedom of speech and what it really looks like in the realm of staff. And in order for me to do that, I have to define what it is that we're actually talking about here. So in order to define this succinctly, I would like to start off with the metaphor of if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And that's how I kind of relate this conversation to staff. We choose our audience. We choose the people that we speak to. So to some respects, we're choosing to speak to students. To some respects, we're choosing to speak to other staff and other faculty. And so when I start talking about freedom of speech, what I'm really talking about is our opportunities to be able to share our perspective. What I'm really talking about is our opportunities to talk about those other ideas that Dr. Reed mentioned as he was speaking. So a couple of the prodding questions that were kind of given to me beforehand, I definitely want to address some of those. So this is going to be a little bit more of a direct approach. And it asks, do individuals within staff feel free to speak about issues and concerns that arise in their particular area? Again, relating this back to the audience that we choose, I feel very strongly that staff perceive their freedom of expression or freedom of speech through their audiences. And so that means that there is a certain level of trust that is built up, whether it be with one's supervisor, or whether it be within one's area, or whether it be with one's students that they oversee. There's going to be a certain level of speech that they're going to let other people experience. And with that, just talking about where the freedom of speech ends and where civility begins, when I really think about that from a staff perspective, I think that our approach has always been is that civility is first. So, when I look at that sentence, I'm really thinking, okay, where does civility begin, and then where does freedom of expression kind of taper off? Because the reality of it is I feel very strongly that when you start talking about civility in terms of freedom of speech, part of understanding freedom of speech is that it happens in a communication perspective. And that is to say that when we speak, there is an audience that is listening. As a staff member, I view myself as a listener. And so I approach that from a civil standpoint in listening to what my colleagues have to say. Because if I don't listen to them, I don't feel that I have given them the proper venue with which to have their ideas heard. And so civility for me starts up front. You're going to get my attention. You're going to get, my ears. And so through that, when I start thinking about the freedom of expression or the freedom of speech, it clearly ends where it starts to imminently affect other people, as we heard our attorneys speak about. So I do believe that, staff, they do have their perspective heard. They do have the ability to speak about the concerns in their specific areas. But again, this is predicated on the relationships that they have built. So, obviously if there's a good relationship, there's going to be more room, I feel like, to talk about some of these freedom of speech kinds of things. If there are what I have termed less than good relationships, then I think there's going to be more concern shown to individuals' ability to maintain their position and subsist. And I don't want to hide it. As a staff member, I think we have things and values that we have to uphold to. And again, it gets back to what Dr. Ogle said about choosing to work at Marion. When we choose to work at Marion, we choose to adhere to the core values and to the ideas that this institution is all about. So kind of moving forward with, civility and, how it's observed when speaking up about, your department or your area. I think, we talk about the introduction of new ideas and how things are done. Obviously, I think there's a difference between introducing new ideas and bashing old ideas, or just cutting down old ideas. And so civility comes into play within how a person presents those ideas. It might be a good idea, but if you present it in a manner that is poor, it's not going to be heard. And so maybe that's more of a tactic than a freedom of speech kind of thing. I mean, obviously, as we've defined, expression is where and when, and then civility is how we say something. So some of the ramifications for incivility, for these incivilities, so how we say things, could create some dissension among coworkers, backbiting, those kinds of things, nasty attitudes, further strained relationships between supervisors and their workers. And then I think that these consequences further result in a subpar product for our students. So if staff don't feel like they have a viewpoint, or if they don't feel like they can confidently but civilly share their ideas, then I think that is going to affect the relationships. And I think one of the things that I've taken away from Marion is that we do a very good job at selling relationships and getting students connected to people on this campus. And I think that without saying too much, I think it goes a long way to support good relationships. So if we're going to talk about some of the ramifications of loss or the perceived loss of freedom of speech, I think, again, we're talking about the strain in relationships. And again, I'm approaching this from a civil standpoint. So please, if you're thinking about, comments that you might have that revolve around incivility, please know that, of course, that's going to strain relationships and those kinds of things. But when I'm looking at this, I'm approaching this purely from a civil standpoint. And so if people are not able to have their civil ideas heard or listened to, then you're going to have these items. So strained relationships, a diminishing value of staff around the university, whether that's perceived or factual. Because I think one of the important things that we need to realize is that perception is reality. And each one of you sitting out there, just as each one of us sitting up here, have our own perceptions. And we shape our realities around those perceptions. And so if we do not perceive that we have the freedom to speak, then we're going to perceive that we are not valued. And so again, I think this affects the end product of the service that we're providing to the students, whether it's from a service perspective or whether it's from an educational perspective. The responsibility towards civility, again, begins even before a person speaks. I think from a staff perspective, I hold true to that in every situation that I try to approach. So again, I think it's something that should be observed on the front lines, and it's something that should definitely be considered. And then they talk about this issue of, do individuals feel free to speak about public, against or something that is adverse to publicly accepted norms. And I think, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse by any means, but again, I think the relationships are what matters. It's the audience that in which we define that is going to drive whether or not we feel like we have the ability to speak. And then just lastly, I want to touch on whether or not, from a staff perspective, if we feel listened to or heard and or respected. And so what I want to do is I want to paint two very distinct pictures for you. The first picture is one that defines what some of these terms mean. So I apologize, I'm a speech communications major, so when I hear the terminology listen and hear, things are very different to me. Because every one of you right now is hearing what I'm saying, because my voice is coming through Audible. But not everybody here is listening to what I'm saying. You're not making the connections to some of the things that I'm putting together, or perhaps you're just daydreaming, and that's okay. We've been going for at least half an hour, and so I know that the average attention span is 10 minutes, or if that. So the difference between being listened and heard to me is a person that is listened to will feel respected, because there will be some actionable items that will be observed out of that. So if I'm talking with my supervisor and I'm giving her some feedback about certain things, I would expect that there's going to be some actions that are to be taken moving forward. And if I see that those actions are taken, I'm going to feel like I was listened to. I'm going to feel respected. And so the flip side of that then is, I'm not going to say that if I don't feel heard, I don't feel respected, because I don't think that that's a direct correlation. But what I will say is that I will feel less respected when there are no actionable items and when things cannot be moved forward. And so just lastly, I want to comment on the culture, and that is to say that from a staff perspective, I honestly believe that the culture is getting better. I think there have been some changes at the university here that have really put staff out on the front line, that have given us the ability to have an audience, that have given us the ability to have that voice. And so with that, we've had Staff Senate, which is in its second year, and we've worked very closely with the Director of Mission and Retention, Kate, and the Human Resources Director to put together and work collaboratively on the evaluation process which has been huge for me because it's given us a voice, it's given us an audience, and I genuinely feel as though we're being listened to, and so I genuinely feel as though we're being respected. And so with that, I will end and let Angie speak.
Well, I think everything about free speech has been said already, but I'll try to give you the perspective of the student. I am Student Senate President, so I do have probably a vastly different experience as a student than most of you. I have a lot of meetings with administrators and faculty and staff, so I tend to be in the public eye more. So like Dr. Ogle stated before, I have to be really careful about what I say, how I act, the pictures I post on Facebook, even small little comments like what I like on Facebook. Most students, I don't think, have a problem with free speech. They say whatever they want on Facebook and maybe don't think of the ramifications of that in the future, like for job prospects. But I'm getting that lesson early, so I think that's beneficial to me. As for the first question, do I feel that individuals, students, feel free to speak about issues and concerns? I think they do, but I also think that students don't know where to go to voice certain concerns and opinions. We have Student Senate, but it's the same 30 to 40 students coming every other Monday. And they do have concerns, and they do use their free speech and say what they think about what's going on campus and in the community. But then there's the other 1,200 students who don't know that Student Senate exists or where to go to say what they're feeling and what they think. So as Student Senate President, I try to talk to students around campus and get their perspectives on issues, but I can't talk to everyone. So I don't know what everyone thinks about free speech, but I would hope that if they do have a concern and if there is an issue that they really do need to speak about, they would know where to go. Dr. DeSalvo's office door is always open if he's there. But there's just so many great relationships you can build with staff and faculty, administration, like Shane was saying. That's the real gift about going to Marion, is that if you do have a problem and you really do want to say what you think, there will be someone to listen, or at least hear you. If they choose to act on what you say is a whole different story, but there is that aspect at Marion, so that's something I really enjoy about going here. Do students feel like they're free to discuss general issues and concern that might be contrary to publicly accepted norms? I think that the Ask Me Anything series that the Science and Math Association started this year has really given students an arena to do that, to ask the questions that maybe are taboo or can't be answered by, well, I'll just give an example. The majority of our population on campus is white. So I can't go and ask another white person about racial issues on campus because, let's face it, we're the dominant culture and the dominant ideology, so we don't see that. So I wouldn't be able to get that opinion and talk freely about race on campus unless I could go to an Ask Me Anything series and ask people of a different race how they view race on campus. So I think that series has given students the opportunity to use their free speech in a civil manner, because of course we always emphasize the human dignity statement, which is really important here at Marion. So I think that we're making progress with students developing their critical thinking skills and asking questions that they're not always allowed to ask in public. So I think we have a pretty good handle on that. The really important question is, do we feel like students are listened to, heard, and respected? I think students probably are at slight disadvantage because we are the consumer, right? So we're here to get the education. We don't set the standards. I'm not a faculty member. I don't know the material as well as someone does. I don't know how to manage my tuition money. that I'm giving the university. So, I mean, for a lot of it, I feel like students maybe are at the bottom of the hierarchy because we don't have control over certain decisions that are made. Maybe we're viewed as a little bit less than because of our age and our inexperience in the world. But I think I do feel like, personally as Student Senate President, that I have been listened to and heard by various administration, faculty, staff members on campus. So we do have that capability, but not all students are going to get that because they, again, don't know where to go. They don't know who to talk to. And they are at a disadvantage because we're 20 years old, most of us, and the people who are our authorities are, I mean, they've been living a lot longer than us, so they know a lot more about this world than we do. Yeah, some longer than others.
She's talking to me.
I think that, I guess I lost my train of thought a little bit, but there are certain circumstances where students aren't listened to. And that, I think that is something that needs to be worked on. I know that this is probably beating a dead horse, but December graduation, and I know you guys all are like, oh, we're talking about it again. But students really put together a coherent and valid argument. We've written resolutions, and I tried to form a committee and get students to get active about December graduation. And I've talked to administration, and they've heard me, but they haven't tried to explicitly outline why the actions were taken, why they were taken, the reasoning behind it. I mean, we get the general answer, but there's no ever detail or reasoning behind it. But then again, sure, the administration isn't taking action and listening and reinstating December graduation, but students aren't doing anything about it either, right? I started this committee and I had 10 people on it, and I was the only one doing any work. So I think there's a difference between saying I want December graduation reinstated and doing. When I think students are really good at exercising their freedom of speech, but when it comes to freedom of action, are actually, I think that that's a whole nother story. And really, as students, like, we have the power to change things on this campus. We don't have to worry about getting fired. So we should really be trying to change the things that we want changed, and creating movements and really being a part of this community and making it what we want it to be, because we're paying $20,000 a year, $25,000 a year to do it, so we might as well get the most out of it, right? Yeah. So what is the student's responsibility towards civility? Well, I think we should all have it. And I mean, just in everything that we do, when you're in a classroom or when you're talking outside of the classroom about a faculty member and their teaching style, I mean, you can be uncivil with your friends about how you talk about that professor, but like Dr. Reed said, would you want the entire university to know what you're saying about this certain person? So I think we need to be careful about that. I think students also have the added aspect of civility, and that they need to be careful about who they're listening to on campus, other students, faculty, and staff, and what ideas they're getting in their heads. Because not everyone is out for the best interest of you. Sometimes there is a little bit of manipulation that goes on in order to maybe subjugate individuals. So I think students really need to be careful and maybe think critically about the civility of those they're talking to and the ideas they're getting with that. With that, I think I'm going to wrap it up and answer questions, because I was worried about 10 minutes, but I think I got it covered, so we're good.
They had a lot of
Yeah.
a little bit longer, so that's okay.
I have to comment on the wisdom that I've heard from the experienced and the less experienced, and the freshness of these presentations is amazing. There's one comment that Angie made that I want to point to in asking whether students are listened to. She said, we're at a disadvantage because they're the consumers. Shouldn't that give them the supreme advantage? The consumers are usually the ones who are listened to. But I want to comment on the freshness of the presentations, and thank you. Our next step in this is basically to allow a few minutes for the panelists themselves to ask for clarifications about things that other panelists might have said. I don't want to spend too long on it, but sometimes we listen to all this wisdom and we have questions, clarifications. So I'd like to spend 5-10 minutes seeing if there are any burning questions that the panelists have of each other. And the process from here on in will be that we'll do that for a few minutes, and then what I want to do is bring up some of the questions that came up at lunch, which when John and I went through, there were some wonderful ones, some kind of stick it to you kind of questions that I think will be fun to answer or to listen to. So we'll do that, and then when those are done, we will open the conversation to the entire audience. So that's the rest of the program. So are there specific questions that any of our panelists would like to ask other panelists? And I will ask them to just kind of say it. Here. Oh, you're talking. I'm not.
No,
I'm the hands-off person. Are there any questions that each of you have for each other?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to Angie a little bit more and talk about the question of incivility and the consequences of incivility for students, and also to ask you the question about how you perceive faculty in terms of that same question about civility or incivility.
Okay, so just to clarify, you want me to talk about...
Well, the question was, what are the consequences of incivility? And you talked about that a little bit more, but I wondered if you could expand on it a little more. And then I wondered if you could speak to what you see in terms of, as you see faculty members and how faculty members are perceived by students, what you see as the consequences of incivility when students perceive faculty members to be behaving in a fashion that's not perceived to be civil.
So some consequences of student incivility. Expulsion. Also, I think that probably of the largest consequences, your image and who people perceive you to be. Because as Shane said, it's all about perception. Kurt Vonnegut has a quote that's, we are what we pretend to be, so you must be careful what you pretend to be. If you are incivil on this campus to your professors, to other students, people are going to know, and people have connections. So your job prospects, again, are going to be probably less than other students. I guess you're going to lose your friendships if you keep being uncivil, right? I mean, those are just general things, like cause and effect. When faculty are uncivil, I think that it causes students to not respect them anymore, to think, why is this person a professor? Why are they trying to teach students if they themselves can't even be civil or be a good person? Because in general, if you're teaching other students, you're really putting a part of yourself into another person. You're giving a little bit of yourself away. So if you're not giving good things away, then that's not very great at all. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I have a follow-up, Jeff, if I may, and this is for all of us. Last evening's speaker, David Shribman, talked about, and he's a journalist for those of us that were not able to participate. He he talked about this sense of censorship from a government limiting free speech and freedom of expression and so on. And he said that's really, as a journalist, he's very sensitive to that, and suggested that that's not the direction we should focus on. It really should be more of a self-regulation to cure some of these ills we're talking about, incivility and so on. I'm wondering, I'm curious to hear from my colleagues on the panel how we might exercise that type of self-regulation here at Marion, if we're aware of students acting in ways that are contrary to our culture, members of the staff, members of the administration, members of the faculty. What are your thoughts about how we might cultivate this sense of self-regulation?
I'd like to go ahead and just start addressing that from the staff's perspective. Because as a staff senate president and as a hall director here, I feel that I operate within both realms pretty closely with respect to students and the staff. And, when I view a student as being in civil, I think there's a certain level of conversation that can take place, just, letting the student know, hey, this is how I perceive you. Is this how you want to be perceived? And really getting them going and really starting them thinking along those lines of, is this what you want your integrity to be? Is this what you want people to say about you? And I think speaking, Angie brought it up in her speech about the human dignity statement. And just as we talk about civility as how you say something, civility is also, how we approach those situations. And so from my perspective, you could easily call a student out among their peers and say, and make them feel kind of shameful for that. Or you can pull them aside at a later time and say, hey, look, I just want you to know that this is what happened and this is how I perceived it. Do you think that is what you wanted? And I think that goes the same on the staff side too. Trying to be very dignifying in how you treat other people, and letting them know when things are being perceived as incivil or when things are being perceived as civil, because obviously positive reinforcement also goes a long way. So taking those moments and those times to thank people for their viewpoints and how civil they present them. So I think, for me, I think the self-regulation comes from an educational standpoint of, approaching it in a very personal conversation, and just asking a person to think on an internal level, is that how they want to be known? Is that what they want their legacy to be?
Thank you. An interesting question. That I want to come back to that a little bit from the standpoint of looking at behavior. What we think, how we behave are not always consistent. We used to do something with the freshmen in the freshman seminar, which is to use the emotional intelligence. There are a variety of instruments that measure emotional intelligence, and I've seen people talk about intelligence, and there are different kinds of intelligence. We generally, in an academic setting, focus on cognitive intelligence, how smart somebody is. But there's another piece of us that makes us successful in our professions, in our careers, in our lives, which is emotional intelligence. And somebody can be very, very smart, but not very sensitive and from an emotional level. And when you look at a lot of the emotional intelligence assessments, they look at dimensions such as self-understanding and self-regulation. One of the things I liked about when we did it with the freshmen was we began to have those discussions about being aware of your emotions and what's going on with you, and also beginning to understand how you can regulate your emotions so you don't shoot yourself in the foot, as it were. And that's something that I think was useful for our freshmen. I think that would also be useful for some of our faculty members. that you know, some of our faculty members, maybe some of our staff too, Shane, I mean, you can be smart cognitively and have great ideas, but if you don't express those in a fashion that other people can understand, if you fly off the handle, if you become irate, if you are irate, if you are not respectful of other people in putting your ideas forth, you lose credibility. And so that happens as well. So in response to your question about self-regulation, I think it's a lot of it's understanding of ourselves, whether we're faculty members or staff members or students. A lot of it has to do with how we see ourselves and our ability to self-regulate. And maybe that's something we need to spend more time on as a community, is better understanding of ourselves.
It's refreshing to have this panel. I'm an outsider. It's refreshing to hear solutions that are not legalistic. Our knee-jerk reaction in our society, in our legal culture, is to look for a legal solution, and I dare say on the issues that are on the sheet or the issues that we've been talking about for the last two weeks, the law is a very clumsy tool. And more often than not on these issues, civility, freedom of speech, threats, concerns, reticence, manners, things of that nature, the law is incompetent to address those issues. And so kudos to the panel that this didn't turn into a half-baked legal seminar, because that's, I don't think, the solution.
If I could interject, I believe, can you hear me? I think that one theme that has been running through is something that really is a simple thought. We're talking about self-regulation, we're talking about intentionality of deciding who your audience is, what you should be saying, how you should be saying it. Shane, you mentioned something about incivility or freedom of speech. Civility comes first. It's all this intentional forethought. How are we going to put something to get our idea across? And isn't it really just like they said, the keynote speaker yesterday said, we should behave the way our mothers taught us to behave. We're assuming our mothers taught us well.
Right.
But in essence, isn't that really the issue? It's behave in the way we were taught to behave. Jeff said it in a way of, do you want to read it on the front page? Shane said it in terms of think about it because that comes first. And someone else said it as how your mother has taught you to behave. And isn't it really treat others the way you want to be treated? It comes down to very simple thoughts.
It is, but we, as a special climate, and that's what we have here. It's a privilege to have the ability to brainstorm and do the things that we do in an academic setting. We certainly don't want to chill free speech. We want to encourage it, and no one here has suggested that we chill it, but to the extent that we think about too much what mother would say or how she would say it can be problematic. It's great advice. It's fantastic advice, and the front page newspaper is something I say to my clients all the time. Or another version of that, Jeff, is if you're at a meeting and you want to say no to a particular proposition, but you don't have the guts to put it in the minutes as to why what the real reason is, then you better come up with a different reason. Or another version, I'll give you Employment Law 101, especially on sex discrimination or race discrimination. If you wouldn't tell that joke with your spouse or your daughter present, don't tell it to the co-employee, and it's interesting how that kind of gets to the heart of it. I don't know where I was going with that, Sheryl, and I'm just trying to mix it up.
There were some amazing questions that came up at the lunch, and you put the opportunity out there for people to ask questions, and sometimes you predict what you're going to get, and then you look at some of the questions and you go, wow, where are these coming from? I think some of them I'd like to bring up now, and I'd like to direct them at the panel, not for every single individual to answer them, but those who feel they have something to say about it, I'd like to hear them, hear these things said. The first group of questions all pertain to freedom of speech and lecturing in class, being in lectures. And the freedom of speech took several different In other words, do we have freedom of speech if Dr. Smith is lecturing and doesn't acknowledge that students are having questions, and all of a sudden the class is over and says, you know, okay, you're dismissed. There was a loss of freedom because of opportunity. And another question, I'm putting them all out there and then I'm going to let you loose on them. Another one was, do students really have freedom of speech with their peers in the classroom? It appears that students have a real concern about saying what they want to say or asking a question in class, not so much because of what the professor is going to think, but what their peers are going to think. And the question arose, I was sitting at the table when it happened, and when the question came up, and it was, well, if somebody's sitting next to me, I don't want them to think I'm stupid. And it really wasn't, and you know, I got a little defensive saying, oh, but we don't think questions are stupid. And the message was, it's not about you, sweetheart. It's about other students. What are other students? If there's a good-looking girl sitting next to me, some guy said, I don't want to ask a question that's going to embarrass me. So we're talking about freedom of speech in terms of opportunity to speak. And do I want to speak because someone might think that I'm not as bright as I'd like to put forth? Another one was all associated with this lecture kind of thing. During our discussion regarding civility, we spoke about one-sided lectures and perceived retaliation when presented with a difference in opinion. Is it possible for one to remain unbiased? And is that really what's in one's best interest regarding higher ed? So here we're talking about opportunity to speak and concern for retaliation. So we're talking about opportunity, we're talking about peer pressure, we're talking about retaliation, and lastly, and certainly not least, a fear of offending or a fear of not saying something quality. So I guess I'm putting all these freedom of speech issues out as an academic institution, as a learning institution. Would anyone like to comment on any?
I'm not going to comment on the heart of it. I'm just going to say those aren't freedom of speech issues. Those are complicated pedagogy and classroom and teaching methodology and honesty and openness and things like that. But I don't want anyone to think that there's a constitutional right to shout down the professor or to have, I mean, it may be horrible teaching technique, right? But it's not this is not a legal issue. So I'll turn it over to the people that are paid to deal with teaching.
I think your point, John, is absolutely well made. What I'm seeing is a perceived inability to say what you want. Not legal, but
the professor chills and discourages the openness that one would think that should be inherent in the educational experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of opportunity or in terms of fear of retaliation or not looking real bright, can I ask comments?
You asked a lot of loaded questions there, Sheryl. But I don't, and you, they're interesting questions. They're good questions. Yeah, thank you, thank you. You know, I'll tell you a little story. I know of a person many years ago, in a prior life, who would walk into class and turn off his hearing aids and start talking, and when the time was up, he would pick up his hearing aid, turn it back on, and walk out the classroom, which was even worse than the professor who has the students there with their hand up and not answering questions. For me as a faculty member, that's a no-no. That's just, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable to practice to me. I mean, if a student has a question, I think you have a responsibility to stop and entertain the student's question. So it's just not my practice, and I'm sorry that that's happening. I don't think it's appropriate.
Jeff, could I mix that up?
Pardon?
Could I just change the facts a little bit?
Sure.
What if the student is a total idiot and the questions are useless and they're disruptive? How do you handle that?
Well, there's a difference.
And the student's questions interfere with the ability to communicate with the other 30 students in the class.
Okay. I made the assumption that the student had a question and that this is not an ongoing pattern of something that is disruptive.
Well done. You changed the facts on me.
I mean, we have had situations where we have students who are disruptive, and they just ask question after question after question after question after question after question, and that's the way it feels, like they are just continually disrupting. Then it's the responsibility of the instructor to steer the discussion back or somehow talk with the student outside of class and say, you know, you asked me 10 questions in class today, and we only got through this much stuff, and this is how much we needed to get through in this class. I'm going to have to ask you to be more judicious in the questions you ask, or I'm going to limit you to 3 questions or something like that. It's the kind of thing that you do in private with a student outside of the classroom, but you do some sort of classroom management with the student in terms of setting limits for them. I've heard it probably 1,000 times, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, sometimes there are stupid questions. But as a professor, you try to pretend like, oh, that's a good question. Now, if you get the student who asks you 15 stupid questions in the last hour, that for me becomes frustrating, John. So, I think it's a matter of classroom management and how you handle it. But for me, it's the situation is, if a student has a question of something they didn't understand or they wanted to follow on something, and it's not this constant barrage of questions, I think that's appropriate, and I think that's something that should be entertained by the faculty member. But the faculty member has to make a judgment about, is this question taking us in a fruitful discussion, in a fruitful direction, is a good use of class time, or it may say, John, that's a good question. Can we talk about that after class? I really like your question, but it's going to take me 10, 15 minutes to discuss that. Let's do that right after class. So it becomes a matter of the instructor doing a good job of classroom management. Does that deal with your question?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say that because, again, as a non-educator, I would hope to a great extent you own that classroom, and I don't want the student representative to misinterpret that. What I mean is that you have to have some control of the time limit and of the process and of the content. It doesn't mean you own the classroom or you own knowledge or you own truth, but if you are helpless to control your own classroom, God help you.
Yeah.
Any other comments on? I've been told I need to use the microphone.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, Sheryl. First of all, I can appreciate settings where somebody may be reticent to ask a question for fear of how others perceive that individual. As I think back to some of my experiences as a student, I was very comfortable in a large setting, being passive that way and taking notes, and would be reluctant to ask a question. And so part of what I learned is it's not so much asking a question, but how we ask the question that got me beyond this fear of looking stupid. So it's a matter of learning from others or seeing how others ask a question. It's the same issue. There's something being missed here, and I'd like some clarification, but it's how I present the question that helped me get beyond that trepidation of looking foolish in front of others. The second comment I have from the other side, as instructors, instructors can choreograph the setting to make sure students that may be uncomfortable asking a question or speaking in a public way have the opportunity to ask the questions. For example, one technique is to stop at a certain point and ask students to write down what are the muddiest points so far without putting your name on the piece of paper. Just saying, or what questions do you have that we're not addressing? Write it down without placing your name, have those collected, and then later on the instructor can pause and address those, or perhaps can be at the end of the class saying, okay, we've been through a lecture today, write down the 2 or 3 points that are still muddy to you, and this is where we'll start next time. So it's a way to ask the questions without being intimidated or having a perception of, my peers thinking less of me for some reason.
Thank you. We're supposed to be done at 2:20, so I'd like to move on to some of the questions and at least address one question from each of the tables. One that came up, and my guess is this is probably going to be more directed at Dr. Reed. Why is it that authoritative voices are more, actually it could be any of us, why is it that authoritative voices are more valid than a student opinion or voice?
You mean my voice?
No. I don't believe any particular voice was...
It's a perceptual phenomenon. I mean, people who present themselves in particular ways seem to have more credibility, and so what they have to say sometimes is given more credence. Is that the way it should be? I don't know. It probably shouldn't be that way. But it has to do with first impressions, walking into a room, engagement between people. I've been in new groups more than once, and I don't know what it is, but whether it's the way I carry myself or whatever, I walk into a group, and 15 minutes in, they're saying, okay, Jeff, you be the leader of the group. And it's like, okay, now what did I do to get that honor? I don't know, but I think the way we perceive each other. It has to do with social phenomena, cues that we give, the way we carry ourselves. Some people carry themselves in a way that they appear to have credibility, authority, whatever, and other people don't. And I don't know how you deal with that. I think it just is.
The scientist in me tells me it's pheromones, but we won't go there.
Fine.
Well, Sheryl, if I could chime in on that really quickly, I think even just looking at the question, it's going to say quite a bit. I mean, if you have a person standing up in front of the room, it's given that they're an authority on the matter in which they're speaking, especially if it's a classroom. And also, what we're talking about is the student opinion here. Everybody's allowed to have an opinion, but credibility is established through information, research, data, all the kinds of stuff that backs that up, which I'm sure most of our esteemed faculty here at Marion, being well-versed in their field, is going to provide. And so inherently, they're going to be seen as more credible. So if you have an opinion and you want it to become more credible, then I guess I would say you need to back it up with a little bit more information.
Right, I agree.
I went to school during the 60s and 70s. Yes, I'm that old. And a typical proposition was that the professor should not be privileged, to use the vogue word, and that authority is hollow, and that all opinions are equal, and students should control the classroom. And it led to some creativity, but more often than not, it led to a form of nihilism or incoherence that perhaps I'm paying for professionally because I lost chunks of knowledge. But the notion that there is someone who's deemed to be more educated and more knowledgeable, and then others who are learning from that person, that's certainly been challenged, and it's a hot issue everywhere, and comes up from time to time. But one would hope that the answer about authority is not self-privileging. Authority makes sense through knowledge, experience, insight, and the recognition of all of those things bundled up to put you in the front of the room rather than in the classroom. I think that was the spirit of that question. Why is it? Where do you get off, Sheryl, saying that you're going to mark my grade? And the answer is pretty obvious. I do have the experience and the education, and I'm here to help you. And by the way, biology has certain facts, and you need to learn those facts. You're not privileged to make up your own facts.
Right. And I think that Jeff touched on this in his presentation, and that really boils down to that we as faculty may have more facts than the students. Presenting them and being open to other ideas will really push you over the edge to being more to having your information and your style be more accepted. In other words, if you're pounding your fist on the podium and saying this is it, and you're not open to anybody's ideas, you're going to be resented. And very, very honestly, if you're a nice guy about it, you're going to be perceived in a better way. Another question that came up, and I'm going to address this one to Angie, because I think as a student, as one of the people who are on the receiving end, you're the consumer. In what ways would you like to expand the boundaries of freedom of speech at Marion while acting within civility? No, not in civility. While acting in a civil fashion is, I think, what they were trying to. You need a rerun on that? Okay.
No, I'm just thinking. To expand on freedom of speech, I don't think that students necessarily need more freedom of speech. I think that they, like I said before, need more freedom of action. I mean, I guess in certain aspects of our education, we can't really say what we think at all times, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I really just wish that students would follow up on their freedom of speech. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
Okay, and I appreciate your people's briefness on these. I have two more questions. One is, how do you civilly inform others when they are exhibiting non-civil behavior, so as not to offend but to inform with respect without being arrogant? Anyone want to take a punch at one?
It's difficult in the public forum. I think those things are best done in private. The unfortunate thing is sometimes things happen in a public forum, and the person who's facilitating that forum has to somehow corral things, gain some order. There are different ways to do it, but that's the responsibility of the leader of that group, of that meeting, of that whatever.
So somehow humility comes into play here.
Right.
And the fact that I render judgment to another thinking that that person's acting in a way that's not civil, so I'm placing myself in a role of judgment, and this is okay because it's part of what we're talking about, self-regulation and regulation among groups. But creating, and so if I decide to act on that, creating an atmosphere or an environment where I would hope the person would be most receptive to my comments, understanding, and this is humility, thinking, well, maybe I misunderstood, or maybe I'm not reading the situation correctly. So I think that has something to do with it, is how it's presented, trying to create the environment to maximize the receptivity of the person that I want to engage in the conversation with. I think goes a long way.
I agree. It's really much of the same things we've been talking about, using forethought, intentionality, and figuring out what your environment is and how you can best say it to make your message heard. I have one last question, and I think I'm going to address this to John. What difference does it make if offensive or illegal speech is communicated to the university anonymously?
I have a confession to make. This was the question at our table.
You had some time for prep.
Thank you for teeing that up, Sheryl.
I did one from each page.
Initially, one would think, well, it's anonymous, it's crap, dump it, right? That may be a luxury that a newspaper has, and most newspapers follow that policy a little more elegantly than I just did, but they won't print an anonymous letter or email. But that's a little tougher as we started to talk about it, and President DeSalvo was at the table and started to think institutionally, all right, it's anonymous, but what if there's credibility, circumstantial evidence to justify, let's say, a bomb threat? Obviously, you don't throw that away. You have to evaluate it. So I'm separating the bomb threat, and if there's uncivil language or harassing language and it's anonymous, there's obviously you can't deal with it. You can't try to educate it, and you certainly can't quote unquote punish it. But to the extent that it causes disruption on a campus, I think as administrators and teachers, you have to deal with it. So what started off to be kind of a smart aleck sophomore question, you just throw it in the wastebasket, that was my reaction. As we were talking at the table, we said, not so quick. It's a complex issue. It depends on what was said and the circumstances, but quite often you can't ignore it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. But if there is a pressing question in the audience that you would like to make public, please ask it. Or if there are questions that you have, any of the panelists will be available while they're packing up their stuff. So thank you for attending, and it was a pleasure having you. And I'd like to thank our panelists. John St. Peter, thank you. Dr. Ogle, thank you. Dr. Reed, thank you. Shane, thank you. Angie, thank you. You were all excellent and refreshing, and I appreciate your participation. And thank you for all attending.